In the heart of New York's Fifth Avenue stands a mansion that looks like it was stolen from some European kingdom. Gothic spires rise toward the sky, marble staircases descend to the sidewalk, gilded details shimmer through towering windows. Frank Woolworth built this palace to prove his worth to the world, the man who turned nickels and dimes into an empire of hundreds of stores. He filled it with European marble and carved wood. He hosted receptions for hundreds of guests who came out of curiosity but never respect. Beneath the gilding, secrets festered that destroyed every generation. Madness, suicide, loneliness in rooms designed for triumph. His daughter broke under the weight of his ambitions. His granddaughter squandered millions and died penniless. The mansion was supposed to be a monument to success. Instead, it became something else. A trap, a tomb, a place where dreams went to die. Frank Woolworth was born on the 13th of April, 1852, in Rodman, New York, a tiny farming community in the northern part of the state near the Canadian border. His father owned a small farm that never produced enough to lift the family above subsistence level. The soil was poor, the growing season short, the work relentless, and the rewards meager. Young Frank hated every aspect of it. He was a sickly child, prone to respiratory infections that left him bedridden for weeks at a time. His parents saw little future for him beyond helping with chores he could barely manage. The family struggled constantly with debt. Frank wore hand-me-down clothes that never fit properly. He watched his mother stretch meals that were already inadequate. The shame of poverty marked him early and deeply. At 16, he left the farm to work as a store clerk in nearby Watertown. The position paid nothing for the first 3 months. It was an apprenticeship designed to teach retail basics, while the employer got free labor. Frank slept in a room above the store and survived on whatever meals the owner's wife provided. He failed at first. His health broke down again. He returned to the farm, defeated and humiliated. The experience confirmed what he already suspected. He wasn't suited for physical work. His future, if he had one, would come from commerce. In 1873, he tried again. Another store, another apprenticeship. This time he stuck with it. He learned to arrange displays, to interact with customers, to track inventory. He discovered he had a talent for understanding what people wanted and how to present it to them. But talent didn't translate to advancement. Store owners viewed clerks as interchangeable labor. Woolworth worked for years without meaningful promotion or salary increases. He watched less capable men move ahead through family connections or social standing he didn't possess. By his mid-20s, he was still earning barely enough to survive. He married Jenny Creighton in 1876. They moved into modest rented rooms. Any hopes of starting a family were complicated by the reality that he couldn't support one. The frustration ate at him. He was smart, capable, willing to work harder than anyone around him. None of it mattered. The rigid class structures of the era kept people like him in their assigned places. Everything changed when he met William Moore, a merchant in Watertown who was willing to experiment with new retail concepts. Moore had heard about a store in Michigan that was clearing out excess inventory by creating a 5-cent counter where everything cost exactly 1 nickel. The idea intrigued Woolworth immediately. Most stores at the time kept merchandise behind counters. Customers had to ask clerks to retrieve items, then negotiate prices that varied based on the clerk's assessment of what the customer could afford to pay. The process was slow, uncomfortable, and inefficient. A fixed-price counter changed everything. Customers could see the merchandise directly. They knew the cost before asking. No negotiation was necessary. Moore let Woolworth try it in February 1878. They set up a 5-cent table at the front of the store with items marked at the single price. Woolworth arranged the goods carefully, making sure everything looked appealing and accessible. The table sold out in hours. Customers loved the clarity and the bargain prices. Moore was impressed but cautious. One successful day didn't prove the concept could sustain an entire store. Woolworth saw something Moore didn't. If a 5-cent table worked, an entire store of fixed-price goods could work even better. The key was volume. Sell enough items at small margins and the profits would accumulate. He convinced Moore to fund an experiment. In June 1878, they opened a great 5-cent store in Utica, New York. Woolworth stocked it with simple household items priced at exactly 5 cents. Needles, thread, pans, toys, soap. The store failed within 3 months. Utica was the wrong market. The location was poor. Woolworth had miscalculated what inventory would actually sell. He was 26 years old and had just watched his first business venture collapse. Most men would have returned to clerk work and abandoned the dream. Woolworth asked Moore to fund one more attempt. Moore agreed, but with strict conditions. Woolworth would get a smaller budget and no salary. He would keep any profits, but absorb all losses beyond the initial stake. In February 1879, Woolworth opened a second 5-cent store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He chose the location more carefully this time. Lancaster had a stable population and steady foot traffic. The store sat on a corner with good visibility. He expanded the concept immediately. Not just 5-cent items, but a second counter where everything cost 10 cents. The 5 and 10-cent store offered more variety and captured customers willing to spend slightly more for better quality goods. The store succeeded. Not spectacularly at first, but steadily. Woolworth learned to rotate inventory constantly, always featuring new items to keep customers returning. He discovered which products sold reliably and which were novelties that needed frequent replacement. The margins were thin. A nickel purchase generated perhaps a penny or two of profit, but customers came in steady streams. Within a year, the Lancaster store was profitable enough to fund expansion. Woolworth opened a second location in Scranton, Pennsylvania, in November 1880, then a third in Harrisburg. Each store followed the same formula: fixed prices, visible merchandise, high volume, low margins. The concept worked because it addressed real frustrations in American retail. Working-class families hated negotiating with condescending clerks who assumed they couldn't afford much. The 5 and 10 stores treated everyone equally. A nickel was a nickel regardless of who spent it. By 1886, Woolworth operated 7 stores across Pennsylvania and New York. He had refined the formula to a science. Location mattered enormously. Corner lots with good foot traffic outperformed interior locations by wide margins. Store layout was crucial. Merchandise had to be visible and accessible, but organized clearly enough that customers could find what they needed without confusion. Woolworth developed relationships with manufacturers willing to produce items specifically for his price points. He ordered in volumes that allowed him to negotiate costs down to levels that made 5 and 10-cent retail prices profitable. The network expanded throughout the 1,890 Woolworth opened stores in Boston, Philadelphia, and eventually New York City. Each new location followed tested procedures. The same layout, the same pricing structure, the same types of inventory. The empire was built on nickels and dimes, but those small coins accumulated into serious wealth. By 1900, Woolworth personally owned stores generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual revenue. He had become rich by serving the same working-class customers who had once been his peers, but wealth didn't erase the memories of poverty or the sting of social rejection. Woolworth moved his family to Brooklyn, then to increasingly expensive addresses in Manhattan. He bought his wife jewelry and fine clothes. He hired servants. None of it changed how old money families viewed him. He was trade, a shopkeeper who had gotten lucky. His fortune came from nickels, not railroads or banking or inherited land. That distinction mattered in the rigid social hierarchies of the Gilded Age. The corporate structure needed consolidation. Woolworth operated his stores through a patchwork of partnerships and individual ownerships that had evolved haphazardly over 30 years. Some stores he owned outright. Others belonged to relatives or former employees who had bought into the expansion using Woolworth's proven formula. In 1911, he orchestrated a merger, the F.W. Woolworth Company Incorporated, absorbing 5 competing 5 and 10 chains into a single entity. The new corporation operated 596 stores, with combined annual sales exceeding $60 million. Woolworth owned the majority of shares. At 59 years old, he had transformed himself from a failed farm boy into one of the wealthiest men in America. His personal fortune exceeded $65 million, equivalent to well over $1 billion in modern currency. But money couldn't purchase the one thing Woolworth wanted most: acceptance by New York's established social elite. The city's old families operated through strict hierarchies that money alone couldn't penetrate. Names like Astor, Vanderbilt, and Morgan controlled access to the best clubs, the most prestigious charity boards, the invitations that mattered. They acknowledged Woolworth's wealth while maintaining clear distance from his origins. He was invited to certain events as a curiosity. The nickel and dime king, who had built an empire from the spare change of working people. The invitations were extended with a condescension that stung more than outright rejection would have. Woolworth's first Manhattan residence was a townhouse on Fifth Avenue, respectable but unremarkable, the sort of address that signaled wealth without commanding real attention. He filled it with expensive furniture and hosted dinners that attracted business associates but few social luminaries. His wife Jenny attended these gatherings reluctantly. She had never wanted this life. The fancy addresses, the servants, the constant pressure to impress people she didn't like and who clearly didn't like her husband. She preferred quiet evenings with her daughters to the social performances Frank demanded. The daughters were caught between their parents' conflicting visions. Helena, the eldest, was beautiful and intelligent but increasingly fragile emotionally. Edna was quieter, more willing to please. Jessie, the youngest, showed early signs of the strong will that would define her later life. Frank wanted his daughters to marry well, not for love necessarily, but for the social connections that would finally break through the barriers he faced. He viewed their marriages as strategic opportunities to link his commercial fortune with established family names. The pressure damaged all three girls. Helena particularly struggled with her father's expectations. She was sensitive and artistic, qualities her father viewed as weaknesses that needed correction through discipline and proper marriage. By 1910, Woolworth had concluded that his townhouse would never serve his ambitions adequately. The address was good, but the structure was ordinary. He needed something that would force New York society to acknowledge him on his terms. He began thinking about a palace, not just a large house, but a residence that would rival the greatest homes in America, something that would make the Vanderbilt mansions look modest by comparison. The idea consumed him increasingly. He spent hours sketching rough designs and collecting photographs of European palaces. He studied Italian Renaissance architecture, French Baroque details, Gothic elements that might be incorporated into an American residence. His business associates thought he was obsessed. The company was thriving and needed his attention for expansion decisions and competitive challenges. Instead, Woolworth spent board meetings doodling architectural details in the margins of financial reports. In 1911, the same year he consolidated the company, Woolworth made a decision. He would build his palace. The location would be Fifth Avenue, the most prestigious address in New York. The design would combine elements from every European style that impressed him. The cost would be irrelevant. He needed an architect who could execute a vision this ambitious, someone who understood grand scale and wasn't afraid of a client who would demand perfection in every detail. Cass Gilbert was the obvious choice. Gilbert had designed the Woolworth Building, the 60-story skyscraper that would become the world's tallest building when completed in 1913. The tower was Woolworth's other monument, a commercial structure that would bear his name forever. The two men had worked well together on the skyscraper project. Gilbert understood Woolworth's need for grandeur, but could translate it into architecture that actually functioned. He didn't dismiss Woolworth's ideas as the fantasies of an unsophisticated merchant. He listened, refined, and delivered. Woolworth approached Gilbert in early 1912 about the mansion project. He wanted a residence that would combine French Renaissance and Italian palazzo influences with some Gothic details similar to the tower. The structure should feel European, but unmistakably American in its ambition. Gilbert listened to Woolworth's descriptions and reviewed the photographs and sketches he had been collecting. He recognized immediately that this would be unlike any private residence he had attempted. The scale Woolworth envisioned exceeded anything built in New York for decades. The site was finalized by spring of 1912. Woolworth purchased property on Fifth Avenue between 80th and 81st Streets. The location offered substantial space for the house and grounds he envisioned. The neighborhood was already established as home to some of the city's wealthiest families. Gilbert began drafting plans. The house would be 5 stories tall with additional service levels. The facade would feature ornate stonework and large windows that flooded interior spaces with natural light. A grand entrance would open onto a marble staircase that rose through multiple floors. Woolworth reviewed every drawing with obsessive attention to detail. He questioned proportions, demanded changes to decorative elements, insisted on modifications that Gilbert sometimes found unnecessary but implemented anyway. The client was paying for exactly what he wanted. The estimated cost climbed as the design evolved. What had started as a $1 million project expanded to $2 million, then $3 million. Woolworth didn't care. He had more money than he could spend in his lifetime. This house would be his legacy, more permanent than any retail empire. He wanted the finest materials available regardless of origin. Rare marbles from Italy and France, woods from South America, decorative elements carved by European craftsmen who still practiced techniques from earlier centuries. If something couldn't be found in America, it would be imported. Gilbert worried about the timeline and logistics. Sourcing materials from multiple continents while managing construction in Manhattan would create delays and complications. Woolworth insisted everything proceed exactly as planned. Delays were acceptable. Compromises on quality were not. By late 1912, construction was ready to begin. The site was cleared and foundations prepared. Workers would arrive by the hundreds as the project ramped up. The mansion that would finally prove Frank Woolworth's worth to a skeptical world was about to take physical form. But even as construction began, warning signs appeared that Woolworth's family was fracturing under the pressure of his ambitions. Helena's emotional state was deteriorating. Jenny was withdrawing further into herself. The palace that was supposed to cement the family's social position was built on foundations that were already cracking. Construction began in early 1913. Workers descended on the Fifth Avenue site in numbers that grew weekly as the project expanded. Foundation work came first. The Manhattan bedrock provided solid support, but excavation required careful coordination to avoid damaging neighboring properties. Woolworth visited the site almost daily. He would arrive in his chauffeured car, step out in expensive suits that seemed absurdly formal for a construction zone, and spend hours examining every detail. Workers learned to recognize his silhouette and the barked questions that followed whenever something didn't meet his expectations. Cass Gilbert tried to manage his clients' involvement diplomatically. Some input was valuable. Woolworth had strong instincts about proportion and symmetry. But his constant presence and endless modifications were slowing progress and frustrating the construction crews. The first-floor walls rose through spring and summer. Workers laid massive limestone blocks for the facade, each piece cut and positioned according to Gilbert's detailed specifications. The stone came from quarries in Indiana, chosen for its color and durability. Interior spaces began taking shape by fall. The entrance hall would feature a grand staircase constructed from white marble, imported from Carrara, Italy, the same marble that Michelangelo had used for his sculptures. Woolworth insisted on it despite the cost and the months required for quarrying and shipping. The marble arrived in crates through late 1913, and early 1914. Italian stonemasons came with it, craftsmen who specialized in working the material. They shaped balustrades and carved decorative details that transformed functional stairs into sculptural elements. Woolworth watched them work with fascination. These men possessed skills that took decades to develop. Their hands moved with confidence born from years of practice. He respected craftsmanship, perhaps because his own fortune came from understanding what quality meant to customers. The main staircase consumed months of work. Each step needed to be precisely level. The risers had to be uniform in height. The balustrade required supports, positioned at exact intervals, with decorative elements carved to match on both sides. The ballroom was designed to occupy most of the second floor. Gilbert had specified a space measuring nearly 60 feet long and 40 feet wide. The ceiling would rise 20 feet overhead, with ornate plasterwork and gilded details that would catch light from massive crystal chandeliers. Woolworth wanted the ballroom to accommodate hundreds of guests comfortably. He envisioned society gatherings that would finally establish his family's position among New York's elite. The room needed to be impressive enough that even the Astors would acknowledge its grandeur. Decorative plaster work began in early 1914. Skilled artisans created elaborate ceiling designs, featuring geometric patterns and floral motifs inspired by French palaces. The work progressed slowly. Each section needed to dry completely before the next could be added. Woolworth grew impatient with the timeline. Gilbert explained that rushing decorative work guaranteed poor results. Plaster that dried too quickly cracked. Details carved hastily looked crude under close inspection. Quality required time. The client understood intellectually, but struggled emotionally with delays. Every month of construction was another month he remained in his inadequate townhouse. Another season of social events where he stood on the margins rather than at the center. Wood paneling for the library and dining room came from England. Oak panels carved with Tudor-style designs that referenced Gothic architecture without copying it exactly. The panels arrived in numbered sections that needed to be assembled like three-dimensional puzzles. Installation required craftsmen who understood traditional joinery techniques. Modern methods using nails or screws were forbidden. The panels would be fitted together using the same mortise and tenon joints that medieval builders had employed. The dining room was positioned to accommodate formal dinners for 30 or 40 guests. Woolworth specified that the table should be able to extend to seat 50 if necessary. He wanted the capacity to host gatherings that rivaled anything the Vanderbilts could manage. A butler's pantry connected the dining room to the kitchen. The space would house china, crystal, and silver that Woolworth was already acquiring from European dealers. He collected place settings for 100 guests, even though he had never hosted more than 20 at once. The third and fourth floors contained private family quarters, bedrooms for Woolworth, his wife, and each daughter, guest rooms for visitors who would stay overnight after elaborate parties. Each bedroom included private bathing facilities, a modern luxury that many older mansions lacked. Woolworth's own bedroom suite occupied a substantial portion of the third floor. A sleeping chamber, a private sitting room, a dressing area with custom-built wardrobes. The spaces reflected his need for both comfort and control. He specified that his bedroom should have multiple windows offering views in different directions. He didn't want to feel enclosed. The room needed natural light throughout the day and cross-ventilation during warm months. The master bathroom featured fixtures imported from France, a large tub carved from a single block of marble, sinks with gold-plated faucets, tile work in geometric patterns that Gilbert had adapted from Italian Renaissance designs. Jenny's rooms were more subdued. She had asked for quiet spaces away from the entertaining areas. She wanted a private sitting room where she could retreat when social demands became overwhelming. Gilbert designed her suite at the rear of the house with windows overlooking the garden rather than the street. Helena's bedroom received special attention from her father. He wanted it to be beautiful enough to inspire her toward the refined behavior he believed she needed to develop. The walls would feature hand-painted scenic murals. The furniture would be antique French pieces he had purchased specifically for her. By mid-1914, the exterior was largely complete. The limestone façade rose 5 stories with ornate window surrounds and decorative cornices. The entrance featured carved details that drew from both French and Italian influences. Passers-by stopped to stare at the emerging structure. Interior work continued through 1915. Electricians installed wiring throughout the house. The electrical system would power lights in every room, a modern convenience that was still relatively new in private residences. Woolworth wanted the latest technology alongside the traditional craftsmanship. Heating systems required extensive planning. Radiators would be installed in every room, connected to massive boilers in the basement. The challenge was integrating modern mechanical systems into spaces designed to look like they belonged in an earlier century. Gilbert solved this by hiding radiators behind decorative grills that matched the room's aesthetic. The grills allowed heat to circulate while maintaining the visual purity of the Renaissance-inspired interiors. The kitchen occupied basement space, with high ceilings and large windows that brought in natural light. Modern appliances were installed to support the cooking required for large gatherings. multiple ovens, vast work surfaces, storage for the quantities of ingredients needed to feed dozens of guests. Staff quarters were also located in the basement and attic levels. Rooms for a cook, housekeepers, maids, a butler, and the various other servants required to maintain a house this size. Woolworth planned to employ at least 15 full-time staff members. The garden behind the house received attention throughout 1915. Landscape architects designed formal plantings in the French style, geometric beds bordered by low hedges, gravel paths connecting different areas, a small fountain as a central focal point. Woolworth insisted on mature trees rather than saplings. He wanted the garden to look established immediately rather than waiting years for growth. Fully grown specimens were transplanted at considerable expense. By early 1916, the house was approaching completion. Final details were being addressed. Door hardware was installed. Window treatments were hung. Furniture that Woolworth had been acquiring for years was moved into appropriate rooms. The total cost had exceeded $5 million, adjusted for inflation, that represented well over $100 million in modern currency. It was among the most expensive private residences ever constructed in America. Woolworth walked through the completed rooms with satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. The project had consumed 4 years of his life. He was 64 years old. His health was declining. The palace he had built to prove his worth had aged him visibly. But it was finished. The monument stood ready to receive the society figures who had dismissed him for decades. Now they would have to acknowledge what he had created. The Woolworth family moved into the mansion in March of 1916. Furniture that had been in storage for months was arranged in rooms designed specifically to display it. Paintings were hung on walls. Oriental carpets covered marble floors. The house that had existed as architectural drawings and construction dust became a lived-in residence. It felt empty immediately. The scale that looked impressive on paper felt oppressive in daily life. Rooms designed to hold dozens of guests echoed when occupied by a single person. Jenny walked the marble halls and felt the isolation intensify with every step. She had never wanted this house. The construction years had been difficult. Watching her husband obsess over details, while family relationships deteriorated. Now they were living in the monument to his ambitions, and it felt like a beautiful prison. Helena's condition had worsened during the construction period. She suffered from what doctors at the time called nervous disorders. Modern diagnosis would likely identify depression and anxiety, possibly bipolar disorder. But in 1916, mental illness was poorly understood and often hidden by families who considered it shameful. Frank refused to acknowledge the severity of his daughter's struggles. He insisted she simply needed discipline and proper social training. The painted murals in her bedroom were supposed to inspire refined sensibilities. Instead, they seemed to mock her inability to meet his expectations. Woolworth planned a grand opening reception for May of 1916. He sent invitations to everyone who mattered in New York society: the Astors, the Vanderbilts, prominent bankers, industrial magnates, cultural figures. This would be the moment when they finally recognized what he had built. The responses disappointed him. Many declined with polite excuses. Those who accepted did so with the same condescension that had always marked their interactions with the retail merchant. They would attend out of curiosity to see the nickel and dime palace, not to honor its owner. The reception took place on a warm evening in mid-May. Approximately 200 guests arrived over the course of several hours. They marveled at the marble staircase and the ballroom's gilded ceiling. They admired the French furniture and the Italian paintings. They complimented Woolworth on his taste while making clear through subtle signals that good taste and old money were different things entirely. Woolworth moved through the crowd accepting congratulations that felt hollow. He had spent $5 million to create a house that would force recognition. Instead, he had built an expensive stage for the same social dynamics that had always excluded him. Jenny stood beside him when required but retreated to her private rooms as soon as it was socially acceptable. She hated these gatherings. The forced smiles, the careful conversations, the knowledge that most guests were critiquing everything they saw. Helena attended briefly but became overwhelmed by the crowd and the noise. She left early, taking refuge in her painted bedroom where the murals seemed to close in around her. The evening ended with polite departures. Guests thanked the Woolworths for a lovely event. Then they climbed into their cars and returned to their inherited mansions, confident that no amount of retail money could purchase genuine belonging. Woolworth stood in his empty ballroom after the last guest departed. Servants were already cleaning, removing glasses and plates, restoring order. He had achieved exactly what he set out to do. He had built a palace that rivaled anything in New York, and it had changed nothing about how he was perceived. The following weeks established patterns that would persist for the rest of Woolworth's life. He went to his office daily, managing the empire that continued to expand. He returned home to a house too large for the family that occupied it. He ate formal dinners in the dining room designed for 30, while often only 3 or 4 people sat at the extended table. Family tensions that had been building for years became impossible to ignore in the new setting. Helena's mental state continued to decline. She spent long periods in her room, sometimes refusing to eat or speak to anyone. Doctors were consulted. Various treatments were attempted. Nothing helped significantly. Edna tried to maintain peace between her father and her increasingly fragile sister. She was the mediator, the one who smoothed conflicts and made excuses. The role exhausted her emotionally, but someone had to hold the family together. Jessie, the youngest, was developing a rebellious streak. She resented her father's attempts to control her social life and marriage prospects. She wanted to make her own choices about whom she would marry and how she would live. The conflicts between them grew more frequent and more bitter. Woolworth retreated into his work. The stores provided clear metrics of success: sales figures, profit margins, expansion into new cities. The business responded to his efforts in ways his family never did. But the mansion consumed resources at an alarming rate. The annual operating costs approached $100,000. Staff salaries, utilities, maintenance, property taxes, the expenses were endless and unavoidable. The house required constant attention to prevent deterioration. Marble needed cleaning and polishing. Wood paneling required treatment to prevent warping and humidity. The heating system needed regular maintenance. Gardens demanded year-round care. Woolworth hired more staff to manage it all. A head butler oversaw household operations. Multiple maids handled cleaning. A chef and kitchen staff prepared meals. Groundskeepers maintained the gardens. The mansion employed more than 20 people full-time. He had built something that required an army to maintain. The house owned him as much as he owned it. Social events continued, but with diminishing frequency. Woolworth discovered that hosting parties in a palace didn't automatically make them successful. Guests still came out of obligation or curiosity rather than genuine friendship. The conversations remained superficial. The connections he sought never materialized. His health began declining noticeably by 1917. He was 65 years old and had driven himself relentlessly for decades. The stress of building the mansion and watching it fail to deliver what he wanted took a physical toll. He developed persistent dental problems that plagued him for the rest of his life, infections that required repeated treatments, pain that made eating difficult. The condition reflected larger issues with his overall health that doctors struggled to address effectively. His mood darkened. Business associates noticed increased irritability. He made decisions impulsively and second-guessed himself constantly. The confidence that had built an empire was eroding under the weight of personal disappointments. At home, he wandered the marble halls late at night when he couldn't sleep. The house that was supposed to be his triumph felt like a mausoleum. Beautifully decorated rooms that nobody used, spaces designed for gatherings that rarely happened, a monument to ambitions that had proven hollow. Jenny watched her husband deteriorate and felt helpless to stop it. She had warned him years earlier that a bigger house wouldn't solve the problems that troubled him. He hadn't listened. Now they were both trapped in his expensive mistake. Helena's condition reached a crisis point in early 1918. She suffered a complete breakdown that required hospitalization. The details were kept private, hidden from society and even from extended family. Mental illness was something wealthy families concealed, not discussed. Woolworth blamed himself while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge his role in her suffering. He had pushed her too hard toward social success she never wanted. His expectations had crushed someone too sensitive to bear their weight, but admitting that would require confronting truths about himself he wasn't willing to face. World War I brought temporary distraction from Woolworth's personal troubles. The conflict created supply challenges for the retail chain. European imports became difficult or impossible to obtain. Prices rose sharply for many categories of merchandise. Managing inventory and maintaining profit margins required constant attention. The war also changed social dynamics temporarily. Old money families who had looked down on retail merchants now found themselves sitting on charity boards alongside people like Woolworth. The crisis demanded cooperation that transcended peacetime social boundaries. Woolworth contributed substantially to war relief efforts. He donated money to the Red Cross and other organizations. He organized fundraising events at the mansion, gatherings that brought together business leaders and society figures for a common purpose. These wartime events were different from his earlier social failures. People attended with genuine purpose rather than obligation or curiosity. The cause mattered more than the host. For a brief period, Woolworth experienced something resembling the acceptance he had sought for decades. But the underlying problems in his family continued to deteriorate. Helena remained institutionalized through much of 1918 and into 1919. The doctors offered little hope for significant improvement. Her condition was chronic, they explained. She would require care for the rest of her life. Woolworth visited her occasionally but found the encounters devastating. His daughter barely recognized him during some visits. Other times, she was lucid but bitter, blaming him for pressures that had broken her mind. The guilt consumed him, even as he insisted to others that he had only wanted the best for her. Jenny withdrew further into herself. She spent most days in her private sitting room, seeing few people outside immediate family. The social performances her husband demanded had become unbearable. She went through the motions when absolutely necessary but no longer pretended to enjoy any of it. Jessie married Charles McCann in November 1918. The wedding was held at the mansion with hundreds of guests. It should have been a triumph for Woolworth, his youngest daughter marrying into a respectable family. Instead, it felt like a loss. Jessie was escaping, leaving the palace that had become a trap. The marriage gave Woolworth a new focus. He doted on Jessie and Charles, lavishing them with gifts and attention. When Jessie became pregnant in 1919, he was thrilled at the prospect of a grandchild. Perhaps the next generation would appreciate what he had built. But his health was failing more obviously. The dental infections persisted despite repeated treatments. He lost weight. His energy flagged. Business associates noticed he struggled to maintain focus during meetings. His mood became increasingly unstable. He alternated between grandiose plans for expanding the retail empire and dark depression about his failures. The pattern suggested what modern observers might recognize as bipolar disorder, possibly the same condition that had destroyed Helena's stability. In March 1919, Woolworth developed a severe infection. The exact source remained unclear, but it was likely related to his ongoing dental problems. Bacteria entered his bloodstream, causing sepsis that antibiotics, not yet discovered, could not treat. He spent weeks confined to his bedroom in the mansion. Doctors visited daily but offered little beyond pain management. Medical science in 1919 had few tools to address systemic infections. Woolworth drifted in and out of consciousness. During lucid moments, he asked about the business and about Helena. He worried about what would happen to the mansion after his death. Who would maintain it? Would his daughters want to live there? The questions revealed his growing awareness that the palace he had built might not survive him. Jenny sat with him but said little. Their relationship had been strained for so long that intimacy was impossible even in his final days. She fulfilled her duties as a wife but couldn't manufacture emotions that had died years earlier. On the 8th of April 1919, Frank Woolworth died in the mansion he had spent $5 million to build. He was 66 years old. The official cause of death was septicemia, blood poisoning from untreated infection. The funeral was elaborate. Hundreds attended, including many of the society figures who had never fully accepted him in life. They came to pay respects to his business achievements while maintaining the same social distance they had always kept. Newspapers published extensive obituaries celebrating Woolworth as a retail pioneer who had revolutionized American shopping. The 5 and 10 concept had made quality goods accessible to working families across the nation. Hundreds of millions of dollars in merchandise had passed through his stores. The mansion received mention but was described primarily as evidence of his wealth rather than his taste. Writers noted the Italian marble and French furniture, but implied that such displays were typical of nouveau riche merchants trying to buy respectability. Helena was not mentioned in most accounts. Families kept mental illness private, especially when it affected young women from prominent households. Her absence from the funeral was explained as health problems that prevented travel. The will divided Woolworth's fortune among his surviving family members. Jenny received substantial assets. The 3 daughters each inherited millions. The retail empire would continue under professional management, but the mansion presented immediate problems. The annual operating costs remained around $100,000. Jenny had no interest in living there alone in a palace designed for entertaining she had always hated. The daughters had their own lives and homes. Within months of Woolworth's death, the family began discussing what to do with the property. Maintaining it seemed financially wasteful when nobody wanted to actually live there. But selling it would be difficult. The house was too large and too expensive for most potential buyers. The mansion sat mostly empty through the remainder of 1919. A skeleton staff maintained basic functions. The gardens continued to be tended, but the rooms that had been designed for hundreds of guests stood silent and dark. Jenny visited occasionally to retrieve personal items or handle estate matters. Walking through the marble halls without her husband's presence felt both liberating and sad. The house had been his dream, not hers. Now it was just an expensive problem. Helena died in 1920 while still institutionalized. The official cause was listed as cardiac failure, but family members understood she had essentially given up. The weight of mental illness and family expectations had crushed her completely. She was 42 years old. Her death was kept quiet. A small funeral attended only by immediate family. No obituary in the major newspapers. The Woolworths buried their daughter and their shame together, hoping both would be forgotten. Woolworth's granddaughter, Barbara Hutton, was born to Edna in November 1912. She would grow up to become one of the most famous and tragic figures of the mid-20th century. The curse of Woolworth wealth would pursue her throughout her life, manifesting in failed marriages, substance abuse, and the same emotional fragility that had destroyed Helena. But in 1920, Barbara was just a child, unaware of the darkness that ran through her family line like a genetic flaw transmitted along with the fortune. The mansion stood as a physical manifestation of everything wrong with Frank Woolworth's understanding of success. He had believed that wealth and impressive possessions would earn respect and acceptance. He had been wrong. The palace he built was magnificent and empty and suffocating. The F.W. Woolworth Company continued operating successfully after its founder's death. Professional managers ran the retail empire using systems Woolworth had developed over decades. Stores kept opening. Sales remained strong through the prosperous 1,920 seconds. But the business faced increasing competition. Other retailers had studied Woolworth's formula and launched their own fixed-price chains. The 5 and 10 concept was no longer revolutionary. It was standard practice being executed by dozens of companies. The Woolworth Building, the 60-story skyscraper that had been the world's tallest when completed in 1913, remained a more enduring monument than the mansion. The tower housed offices for the corporate headquarters and generated rental income from other tenants. It was beautiful and functional, representing Woolworth's business acumen in ways the residents never could. The mansion, meanwhile, presented escalating problems. Jenny Woolworth had no intention of living there. She moved to a smaller, more manageable home and left the palace largely empty. The costs of maintaining a vacant property were staggering. The retail company's board considered options. They could sell the mansion, but finding a buyer would be difficult. They could convert it to another use, but the design was so specific to residential purposes that adaptation seemed impractical. They could demolish it and sell the land, but destroying such a recently completed structure felt wasteful. The house sat empty through most of the 1,920 seconds. A minimal staff kept it from falling into disrepair. The gardens were maintained at a basic level, but the building was clearly not being used for its intended purpose. Potential buyers occasionally toured the property. Wealthy families considered whether they could adapt it to their needs. The reactions were consistently negative. The house was too large, too expensive to operate, and too closely associated with Woolworth's failed social ambitions. The Great Depression that began in 1929 eliminated whatever slim chances existed for selling the mansion at a reasonable price. Real estate values collapsed. Wealthy families who might have afforded the property in prosperous times were now struggling to maintain what they already owned. The Woolworth Company was also suffering. Consumer spending dropped precipitously. The nickel and dime stores that had thrived when working families had spare change now watched those same customers cut purchases to absolute necessities. Revenue fell sharply. Profits vanished. Maintaining an expensive vacant mansion made no sense under these circumstances. In 1931, the company put the property on the market at a drastically reduced price. They would accept almost any reasonable offer just to eliminate the ongoing costs. No buyers emerged. The mansion sat unsold through the worst years of the Depression. The property became an embarrassment, a white elephant that nobody wanted even at bargain prices. Preservation groups discussed whether the house had historical significance worth protecting. The architecture was impressive, certainly. Cass Gilbert was a respected architect, but the building was barely 15 years old. It lacked the historical patina that made older structures worth preserving. The artistic and cultural value was harder to assess. The interiors featured quality craftsmanship and expensive materials. But did that make it culturally significant? Or was it just an expensive vanity project by a merchant who had more money than taste? The debates continued without resolution. Meanwhile, the mansion deteriorated from neglect. Water damage appeared in some rooms. Paint began peeling. The gardens grew wild without regular maintenance. By the mid-1930 seconds, demolition was being seriously discussed. The land was valuable even if the structure wasn't. Fifth Avenue real estate could be redeveloped into apartment buildings that would generate income rather than consuming it. Architectural historians protested. Cass Gilbert had died in 1934, making the mansion one of his final major works. Destroying it would erase an important example of his residential design. The argument had merit, but insufficient support to prevent demolition. In 1937, the Woolworth Company received an offer from a developer who wanted to tear down the mansion and build luxury apartments on the site. The price offered was well below the property's theoretical value, but it would end the financial drain. The company was prepared to accept when preservationists mounted a last-minute campaign. They argued that the mansion should be converted to institutional use rather than demolished. A museum, perhaps, or a private school, something that could utilize the grand spaces while preserving the architecture. The campaign delayed the sale but didn't produce an alternative buyer. No institution had the resources to purchase and maintain the property. The Depression had devastated charitable giving. Museums and schools were cutting budgets, not expanding facilities. World War II intervened before the sale could be finalized. The developer withdrew his offer, citing uncertainty about wartime construction restrictions and material availability. The mansion remained unsold and increasingly dilapidated. During the war years, portions of the building were used for civil defense purposes. Air raid wardens met in some rooms. Storage for emergency supplies filled others. The use was temporary and did nothing to address the fundamental problem of what to do with the property long-term. Jenny Woolworth died in 1924, relatively early in this saga. She never had to witness the full extent of her husband's mansion becoming an unsolvable problem. Her daughters inherited portions of the estate, but wanted nothing to do with the Fifth Avenue property. Barbara Hutton, Woolworth's granddaughter, came of age during this period. She inherited a substantial portion of the retail fortune when she turned 21 in 1933. The money made her one of the wealthiest young women in the world. It also destroyed her life. Barbara married 7 times, each marriage ending in disaster. She developed addictions to alcohol and prescription drugs. She was exploited by countless people who saw her only as a source of money. The pattern of family tragedy that had killed Helena continued in the next generation. Barbara briefly considered taking over the mansion in the 1,940 seconds. She visited the property and walked through rooms her grandfather had built, but she recognized immediately that living there would be a mistake. The house carried too much darkness, too many failed dreams, and broken lives. She declined any involvement with the property, leaving it to the retail company to handle. They continued searching for solutions that never materialized. By 1950, the mansion had been vacant for nearly 30 years. Vandalism had damaged some interiors. Weather had penetrated the roof in several places. The structure was still fundamentally sound, but restoration would require substantial investment. The question remained, who would make that investment and why? The building had no practical use that justified its costs. Sentiment alone couldn't preserve it indefinitely. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source in 1954. New York University was searching for additional facilities to accommodate post-war enrollment growth. The institution needed classroom space, administrative offices, and housing for faculty. The Woolworth Mansion offered all of that in a single location. Negotiations proceeded cautiously. NYU couldn't afford to purchase the property outright at anything approaching its original value. The Woolworth Company wasn't expecting full value anymore. They simply wanted the financial burden removed. A creative solution emerged. NYU would lease the mansion with an option to purchase at a reduced price after demonstrating it could be maintained successfully. The arrangement gave both parties what they needed. The university gained space without massive upfront investment. The company eliminated ongoing costs while preserving the possibility of an eventual sale. The conversion began in 1955. Contractors divided the grand ballroom into multiple classrooms using temporary partitions. The dining room became a faculty lounge. Bedrooms were converted to small offices. The transformation was functional rather than elegant, but it worked. Students and professors occupied the mansion throughout the late 1,950 seconds. The marble staircase saw daily traffic from hundreds of people. Rooms that had stood empty for decades filled with lectures, meetings, and academic administration. The building had purpose again, even if that purpose bore no resemblance to Woolworth's original vision. But the arrangement was always temporary. NYU needed modern facilities designed for educational use, not adapted palaces. The compromises required to make the mansion functional were substantial. Maintenance costs remained high. The university began planning new construction that would eventually replace the Woolworth property. By 1960, NYU had decided not to exercise its purchase option. The mansion had served its purpose as temporary space during a growth period. Now the university was moving forward with purpose-built facilities elsewhere. The Woolworth Company found itself back where it started. The property was vacant again. The brief period of institutional use had at least maintained the structure and prevented further deterioration. But the fundamental question remained unanswered. Preservation battles intensified during the 1,960 seconds. New York was losing historic buildings rapidly to development pressure. Architectural historians argued that significant structures from the early 20th century deserved protection, even if they weren't colonial landmarks or Victorian masterpieces. The Woolworth Mansion became a test case. It was barely 50 years old. Did it qualify for landmark status? The architecture was impressive, but derivative of European styles rather than distinctly American. The historical significance came primarily from Woolworth's business achievements rather than anything that happened in the house itself. The Landmarks Preservation Commission reviewed the property in 1963. Their assessment was mixed. The exterior had architectural merit. Cass Gilbert's reputation justified consideration. But the interiors had been heavily altered during the NYU conversion. Much of the original detail had been damaged or removed. The commission declined to grant landmark status. The decision opened the door for redevelopment. The property could legally be demolished and replaced with something more economically viable. Real estate developers immediately began submitting proposals. The Fifth Avenue location was extremely valuable. High-rise apartment buildings could generate substantial returns, The mansion itself was irrelevant to these calculations except as an obstacle to be removed. In 1965, a development company purchased the property with explicit plans for demolition. They obtained the necessary permits and scheduled the work to begin in early 1966. Wrecking crews would reduce Woolworth's palace to rubble over the course of several weeks. Preservationists organized protests. They picketed outside the mansion. They wrote letters to newspapers. They lobbied city officials to intervene. The campaign generated publicity, but insufficient political support to stop the demolition. The scheduled destruction date approached. Equipment was staged nearby. Workers prepared to begin tearing down the exterior walls. The mansion that had survived decades of neglect and uncertainty appeared to have finally reached its end. Then, an unexpected buyer emerged. A private investment group made an offer that the developers found attractive enough to abandon their demolition plans. The exact terms weren't disclosed publicly, but the price was reportedly well below the property's development potential. The new owners announced plans to convert the mansion into luxury condominiums. The idea seemed improbable given the building's unusual configuration and the previous failures to find economically viable uses. But the investors insisted they could make it work. Conversion began in 1967. The project required completely reimagining the interior spaces. The grand ballroom was divided into multiple units. Large bedrooms became studio apartments. The marble staircase remained as a common area feature, but nearly everything else was altered dramatically. Craftsmen tried to preserve some of Woolworth's original details. The Carrara marble couldn't be replicated, so it was carefully maintained. Some of the wood paneling survived in sections that became featured walls in individual units. The exterior facade was restored to its original appearance. The work consumed 3 years and millions of dollars. The investors had gambled that wealthy New Yorkers would pay premium prices for apartments in a historic mansion, even one with such a troubled past. The question was whether the market would validate their assumptions. The first units went on sale in 1970. The response was cautiously positive. Some buyers appreciated the unique architecture and historical connection. Others were attracted by the Fifth Avenue address and the careful restoration of original details. Not all units sold immediately. The conversion had created some awkwardly shaped spaces that didn't appeal to conventional apartment buyers. But gradually, the building filled with residents who were willing to accept quirks in exchange for living in a piece of New York history. The mansion had survived, but in a form Woolworth would barely recognize. His palace had been carved into pieces and sold to strangers. The rooms where he had hoped to host society gatherings now housed dozens of separate households. The unified vision had been shattered into fragments, yet the building still stood. The exterior looked much as it had when completed in 1916. Pedestrians walking Fifth Avenue could still see the limestone facade and the architectural details that Cass Gilbert had designed. The physical structure had proven more durable than the dreams that created it. The condominium conversion established a pattern that has persisted for decades. The building operates as luxury residential units, with a condominium association managing common areas and coordinating maintenance. Owners come and go, units change hands, but the structure itself remains. Modern residents know little about Frank Woolworth beyond basic facts. He built the house. He made his fortune in retail. He died here. The deeper story of family tragedy and social failure rarely gets discussed. Real estate listings emphasize architecture and location, not the darkness that once filled these rooms. The marble staircase still dominates the entrance hall. Residents and visitors climb the same steps that Woolworth ascended daily during his final years. The Carrara marble has acquired a soft patina from a century of use, but it remains structurally sound and visually striking. Some original details survive the conversion intact: sections of carved wood paneling, a few of the decorative ceiling elements, the basic proportions of certain rooms. These fragments offer glimpses of what the mansion looked like when first completed, though they're now isolated within spaces that have been fundamentally altered. The exterior has been maintained carefully. The limestone facade receives regular cleaning and repair. The windows have been replaced with modern versions that match the original appearance while offering better energy efficiency. From the street, the building looks much as it did in 1916. Preservation groups cite the mansion as an example of successful adaptive reuse. The building was saved from demolition through conversion to a purpose that could sustain its operating costs. The architecture remains visible, even though the interior function has changed completely. Critics argue that dividing Woolworth's unified vision into separate units destroyed precisely what made the mansion significant. The grand spaces that defined the original design no longer exist. What remains is fragments of architecture without the coherence that gave them meaning. Both perspectives have merit. The building survived, which preserves something, but what survived is fundamentally different from what Woolworth created. The question of whether preservation through transformation counts as genuine preservation remains debated among architectural historians. The Woolworth retail empire followed a different trajectory. The 5 and 10 stores continued operating through the mid-20th century, but the business model faced increasing challenges. Discount retailers offered lower prices. Department stores provided more upscale environments. The Woolworth concept occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. The company attempted various adaptations, larger stores with expanded product lines, different pricing strategies, international expansion. Nothing restored the growth that had made Frank Woolworth wealthy. The retail landscape had changed too much. The last Woolworth store in the United States closed in 1997. The company had filed for bankruptcy the previous year. 88 years after Woolworth's death, the empire he built had finally collapsed. The name survived for a while in other countries, but the American operation was finished. The Woolworth building, the skyscraper that had been his other great monument, proved more durable than the retail chain. The tower has been converted to luxury residential units in its upper floors, while maintaining commercial space below. It remains one of New York's most distinctive landmarks. Barbara Hutton, Woolworth's granddaughter who inherited a substantial portion of his fortune, died in 1979. She was 66 years old, the same age her grandfather had been at his death. She died essentially penniless, despite inheriting over $50 million. The money had been consumed by failed marriages, exploitation by advisors, and her own destructive choices. Her life trajectory mirrored Helena's in disturbing ways. Both women struggled with mental health issues. Both felt crushed by family expectations and wealth that brought no happiness. Both died young relative to their potential lifespans. The pattern suggested that Woolworth's fortune carried a curse that destroyed those who inherited it. The mansion plays no role in Barbara's story. She never lived there and rarely visited. The building was already gone from family control by the time she came of age. But the psychological weight of being a Woolworth heir affected her just as profoundly as it had affected her aunt Helena. The question of whether the mansion is haunted comes up periodically. Some residents and visitors report unsettling experiences. Footsteps in empty corridors, doors opening without explanation, a pervasive sadness in certain rooms that seems disconnected from any immediate cause. Skeptics dismiss such claims as imagination fueled by knowledge of the building's tragic history. Believers suggest that Woolworth's restless spirit remains trapped in the palace that failed to deliver what he needed. The truth is unknowable and probably beside the point. What's certain is that the building retains an atmosphere that newcomers often find oppressive. The grandeur carries weight. The history presses down. Walking through the common areas, it's difficult not to think about the man who built this and what it cost him. Contemporary New York has largely forgotten Frank Woolworth. His name appears on the building and occasionally in historical accounts of retail innovation. But he's not remembered the way Vanderbilt or Rockefeller or Morgan are remembered. His fortune was substantial but not generational. His monuments were impressive but not enduring in their original form. The mansion stands as his most visible remaining legacy in residential architecture. Tour guides sometimes point it out to visitors. Architectural historians include it in studies of Cass Gilbert's work. Real estate agents use it as a selling point for the neighborhood. But few people know the full story of why it was built and what happened to the family that occupied it. Woolworth built the palace to force society's recognition and acceptance. Instead, he created a monument to the futility of trying to buy belonging. The house that was supposed to establish his family's place among New York's elite became evidence of an outsider's misunderstanding of what actually mattered. The mansion survives not because Woolworth's vision was vindicated, but because it was abandoned. Only when the building stopped being a private palace and became divided residential units did it find sustainable purpose. The transformation that enabled survival was exactly what Woolworth would have considered failure. The dark secrets are largely forgotten now. Helena's breakdown and institutionalization, the family's disintegration, Woolworth's lonely death in rooms designed for triumph, Barbara Hutton's tragic life trajectory. These stories exist in historical records but rarely enter contemporary awareness. What remains is the architecture, the limestone façade, the Carrara marble staircase, the fragments of carved detail that survived conversion. These physical elements persist, while the emotional weight that created them has dissipated. The house has outlasted the darkness that built it. Whether that counts as victory or just survival depends on perspective. The building still stands, which is more than can be said for most Gilded Age mansions. But it stands as something completely different from what its builder intended. The palace became apartments. The monument became real estate. The dream became just another property changing hands through normal market transactions. Frank Woolworth wanted to build something that would last forever and force recognition of his achievements. He succeeded at the first goal and failed completely at the second. The mansion endures, but as a testament to the limits of what wealth can accomplish rather than its power.